Does Israel's move towards recognizing Somaliland signal a calculated attempt to secure leverage over the Red Sea and counter Houthi movement disruptions? Or is there a broader strategic realignment at play, especially given strong opposition from the US and major European powers? Additionally, how does Somaliland's largely Islamic society reconcile political support for Israel in the current regional and ideological climate? And Karthik says, could you provide some history and context about Somaliland and why Israel chose to recognize it? And why are all the other major countries criticizing this move, Somaliland? So, first of all, let's go to the map. We haven't opened the map today, so let's do that. Where is Somaliland? And is it in a geographically interesting location? So, okay. So, okay, we are here. We know where India is. Now we go westwards. And west of India, we have, along the Horn of Africa, a nation called Somalia. The capital is Mogadishu. If you go northwards, there is a city called Hargeisa, which is part of Somalia, but it's actually the capital of Somaliland, a de facto nation. So let us search for Somaliland. And then Google Maps will show us this region. As you can see, this shaded region, which is a de facto separate nation. It is not controlled by the government in Mogadishu, the Somalian government. I mean, whatever government exists, it's a de facto separate nation. So that's the situation. Now, as you can see, this nation is located essentially at the mouth of the Red Sea. Between the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, you have this choke point, extremely important geographic choke point, the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. Okay? And Djibouti is the nation that is the nation at the choke point. The other one is Yemen, South Yemen. And then we have Somaliland. And of course, you have Eritrea also here, Asmara. Eritrea is kind of aligned with the West. So Djibouti is also, you could say, aligned with the West. And if Somaliland becomes aligned with the West, then they can control the entire region through the use of these territories. And if they can create a separate nation called South Yemen, for example, which is controlled by the West or by Western allies in the region, well, then the entire choke point is completely controlled, and you can choke off on demand, supplies going eastwards towards China. If you can do the same thing, if the West can, for example, overthrow the Iranian regime, the government in Tehran, and bring the blessings of democracy and human rights to Iran, then they can also control the Strait of Hormuz. And by doing that, they can blockade China. See, we in India talk about blockading the Strait of Malacca. The Americans don't worry about Malacca. They will blockade Bab el-Mandeb over here, and they will blockade Hormuz in case they are able to overthrow the government in Tehran and install a puppet regime. If they can do that, they can seriously squeeze China without ever having to go near Malacca. That's how the US thinks. India thinks of Malacca. The US thinks of Bab el-Mandeb and Hormuz and other things as well. So now that we understand that Somaliland sits in a very interesting geographical and geopolitically sensitive location, that's the first thing we have to understand. Now let's talk about the history of Somaliland. Okay? So the capital of Somaliland, like I said, is Hargeisa, that city in the north. Somaliland, what is it? And how is it a separate de facto country? So Somaliland is a self-governing breakaway region in that region northwest of Somalia, like we saw on the map. It operates as a de facto independent state. And until very recently, it had no formal international recognition. It's not a UN member state, for example. Yeah. So Somaliland has its own constitution. It has an elected president. It has a parliament. It has a government. It has a judiciary. It has an army, security forces. They have their own currency, the Somaliland shilling, and they hold separate elections from Somalia. I'm not sure if there are elections in Somalia, but Somaliland has elections. Okay. So it functions separately from Somalia from a political perspective and administrative perspective. Somaliland has not been governed from Mogadishu since 1991. They run their own domestic affairs, they run their own external affairs. So this is a classic de facto state. Now, how did this happen is the question. As always, we have to go back a few decades and understand the history. And when we talk about history, we're going to talk about European colonization. All these issues, all these problems, the root cause goes back to European colonization. So, from the late 19th century until 1960, this place called Somaliland was ruled by Britain. The British called it a protectorate, whatever it means. Okay? And they ruled the place. It was called British Somaliland. Further south, the Italians ruled a place called Italian Somaliland, which is today's Somalia. Okay, to the south. So in the north, you had British Somaliland. In the south, you had Italian Somaliland. These were two separate colonial territories with different administration and different administration styles and legacies and so on. Okay, so 1960, I said, right? So 1960, British Somaliland became independent. It became the state of Somaliland. It was recognized by more than 30 nations, okay, including permanent members of the UN Security Council. But this situation lasted only a few days. The same year, the southern state of Somaliland, it became independent, and the northern state of Somaliland voluntarily united with the former Italian-ruled territory, which had just gained independence. So this formed Somalia, or the Somali Republic, and the capital was in Mogadishu, down south. Then in the 1960s and 70s, you had, the people of northern Somaliland, okay, they started getting the sense that they were being marginalized by Mogadishu, okay. The political and economic center of gravity is actually a term, yeah, that was in Mogadishu, in the south. And it was the southern elites who were ruling everything, and the northerners were marginalized. Then in 1969, there was a coup in Mogadishu. It brought to power a fine gentleman named Siad Barre. Let's see what this fine gentleman looked like, shall we? Siad Barre. So he was a dictator. Mohammed Siad Barre. He was a military officer, obviously, and he was the president of Somalia from 69 all the way until 1991. Right? So Siad Barre comes to power. Siad Barre comes to power in Mogadishu, and he is obviously a dictator, authoritarian rule, and his treatment of the northern part of Somalia, which is Somaliland, it obviously deepened the grievances that the people of the region had, and he repressed them, etc. His policies were very nasty, brutal, whatever you want to say. So then this launched a movement to bring independence to Somaliland in the 1980s, early 1980s. So an armed rebellion was launched against the regime of Siad Barre. And Siad Barre's military forces devastated the northern cities, bombardment and all kinds of human rights things, and standard atrocities that you have in these countries and so on. So large numbers of civilians were killed. Many people had to run away, flee into exile. And this experience that the people of the northern region had at the hands of Siad Barre and his military regime, that is central to the justification of Somaliland, that that the union with the south was intolerable and it had to go. So in 1991, Siad Barre's regime collapsed. Okay, and the central Somali state down south, ruled from the south in Mogadishu, it disintegrated. There was no government anymore. Okay, you had different factions in different regions, different warlords and different pirates and God knows what. I think there was a person called Mohammed Farah Aidid who was ruling Mogadishu, and he fought the US for a while. Clinton was the president, yeah, that sort of thing. So you had different factions in different regions who asserted control, And the north came under the influence of the Somaliland independence movement people. So in 1991, um, the people of the northern region, Somaliland, they declared independence. They said that the 1960 Union had effectively ended, and they proclaimed that the Republic of Somaliland was now in existence within the borders of the former British occupied territory, the British protectorate of British Somaliland. So they said that this was not a secession from Somalia, but a restoration of independence. Okay, we had voluntarily merged with Somalia, but we were treated brutally, we were oppressed, and now we are withdrawing and we are restoring the independence that was rightfully ours. Yeah, so that union was failed, it was unlawful, it was oppressive, and we have exited from it. So that was in 1991, right? And then they formed a constitution, I think, in 2001. They drafted a constitution. There was a referendum which adopted the constitution, and Somaliland was reconfirmed that it was independent, and its political system was enshrined in the constitution, like we in India like to say, a presidential system, a legislator with an upper house and a lower house. The lower house was a house of representatives that would be elected. The upper house would be an unelected house of elders, like an Indian Rajya Sabha kind of thing. Yeah, and there was a limit of 3 political parties to ensure that there is not too much fragmentation in the country, and all that. So that is how Somaliland was formed. It became separate from Somalia, de facto separate. So there is something called the Montevideo criteria. Okay, a sovereign nation has a defined territory. It has its own population. It has its own government. It has its own capability to run its own economy and international relations and so on and so forth. So Somaliland, it satisfies all the so-called Montevideo criteria, and yet it has remained largely unrecognized by other nations. The African Union doesn't recognize Somaliland. Many other nations don't recognize Somaliland. So what is the reason for that? The African Union fears that if we recognize Somaliland, it will encourage other secessionist movements in the region, in Africa, and it will undermine Africa's norm of respecting colonial borders. So Africa has this norm that we will respect colonial borders. I don't know why they have this norm. They should disrespect, in my opinion, all colonial borders. But Africa has a norm. So that's called colonization, mental colonization. So Africa has the norm of respecting colonial borders. And if we recognize Somaliland, then it will encourage other secessionist movements and so on and so forth. And it will undermine the norm of respecting colonial borders. In the case of Somaliland, you're actually respecting the old colonial borders, but whatever. That sort of thing. And Somalia opposes the partition, right? And there are various nations, especially Western nations, that engage with Somaliland through liaison offices or whatever they call the technical cooperation, but they don't recognize the country. For example, the US. The US has intermittently used the Somaliland territory for counter-terrorism operations, counter-terrorism cooperation, maritime security arrangements in the Gulf of Aden, etc. But they don't recognize Somaliland. Ethiopia is a long-term, ally of Somaliland. Now let's once again revisit the map to understand why. Okay, where is map? We bring map. Let's understand why Ethiopia is an ally, you could say, of Somaliland. So zoom in. So there was a time when the country of Eritrea was part of Ethiopia, but then they broke free and they formed a separate country. And that had the effect of landlocking Ethiopia. Ethiopia became a landlocked country. They don't have access to the Indian Ocean. They don't have access to the Gulf of Aden. They don't have access to the Red Sea. Terrible. So that is the situation that was imposed upon Ethiopia. So what did Ethiopia do to, let's say, remedy this situation? What Ethiopia did is that it cultivated close economic and security ties with Somaliland. And Ethiopia has been for a long time using Somaliland's Berbera port as an outlet to the sea. Ethiopia needs access to the sea. So they're using the Berbera port of Somaliland uh, as this port of access to the sea. And in 2024, Ethiopia and Somaliland signed a memorandum of understanding that would give Ethiopia access to a naval facility near Berbera. And the promise was that we will give recognition, official recognition to Somaliland. And this caused a crisis, diplomatic crisis between Ethiopia and Somalia, that sort of thing. The UAE is also involved in Somaliland. They have secured a deal to operate the Berbera port, develop and operate the Berbera port through a UAE-based company. And they potentially may build a military facility or air base over there. So the UAE is involved in Somaliland's economic infrastructure and also security infrastructure. Saudi Arabia is also involved in various ways, religious, economic cooperation, security channels, livestock trade, countering extremism, etc. So Saudi Arabia is also aligning its Somaliland into its Horn of Africa, foreign policy. And the objective is to counter Iranian influence and so on and so forth. Now, with all of that understood, okay, that's the history. Now, a week or so ago, Israel became the first nation to formally recognize the Republic of Somaliland as an independent and sovereign country. And they signed a joint declaration of mutual recognition with the president of Somaliland. Mutual recognition means Israel recognizes Somaliland and Somaliland recognizes Israel, right? And now there is news that maybe India may be on the way of towards recognizing Somaliland potentially, yeah, that sort of thing. So that is the situation. Okay, that's the situation. So why has Israel chosen to recognize it? Because of the incredibly valuable, important geographical location, right? Israel has faced a lot of problems from the Ansar Allah faction in Yemen, the so-called Houthis, and the West wants to control the Strait of Bab al-Mandeb. So you control Somaliland, you control Djibouti, you control Eritrea. That gives you one half of the puzzle. And if you can create a separate nation in Yemen, maybe South Yemen or something, that is aligned with the West, then that is a done deal then. So slowly but steadily, all the pieces on the chessboard are falling into place. So that's why Israel has done this. It's important for Israel that they are able to control this region. And that's important for the US as well.